The smell of burning oil and cordite drifts across the sands of Cyrenaica as Italian armor burns in the winter wind. The Western Desert Force is dismantling an empire, threatening to push all the way to Tripoli. On January 11, 1941, Adolf Hitler signs Directive No. 22. The strategic calculus is strictly limited. The operational objective is not conquest, but life support. A small, mechanized blocking force is dispatched to North Africa solely to hold Tripolitania and prevent a total collapse of the Axis alliance on the southern flank. High Command calculates a surgical, low-cost intervention. They dispatch Erwin Rommel to stabilize the line, expecting a static defense. The theater of war is viewed as a minor containment zone, a temporary fix, while the true industrial might of the Third Reich prepares for larger campaigns. Yet, a strictly defensive directive, signed on a cold winter day, is about to mutate into an uncontrollable, continent-spanning offensive. There exists a danger that our friend Rommel is becoming a kind of magician or boogeyman to our troops, writes General Sir Claude Auchinleck. This psychological dominance masks the underlying fragility of the Axis position. By June 21, 1942, the fortress of Tobruk collapses in just 2 days. 35,000 men, mostly South African defenders, are captured. The speed of the breach fractures the Allied defensive lines. The British 8th Army retreats in disarray toward the Egyptian border, leaving a trail of burning equipment. They are reduced to barely 70 operational tanks. Erwin Rommel is rapidly promoted to Generalfeldmarschall. The tactical maneuvers of the Afrika Korps create an illusion of invincibility. Auchinleck orders his officers to dispel the idea that the commander of the Panzer Armee Africa represents something more than an ordinary German general. The psychological impact is measurable. British forces begin recommending a 3-to-1 numerical advantage just to engage the panzers in open combat. The Axis forces ride a wave of operational momentum, capturing vast stretches of territory and pushing relentlessly east. The tactical victory appears total, blinding observers to the structural realities of the campaign. The map shows continuous advancement, yet the logistical tether stretches thinner with every mile gained across the barren North African terrain. The Italian 20th Corpo d'Armata and the German mechanized units outflank 8th Army defenses repeatedly. This operational success conceals a mathematical deficit. With the 8th Army shattered and the fortress of Tobruk secured, the advancing Panzer Armee Africa seems unstoppable. What invisible mathematical force is already sealing the fate of this victorious army? While the Panzer Armee Afrika fights a mechanized war at the edge of the Sahara, its own high command views the theater as a mere distraction. General Alfred Jodl dismissively refers to the entire North African campaign as Rommel's little shooting expedition. This single phrase encapsulates the fatal assumption driving Berlin. The core belief dictates that tactical maneuvering can override logistical mathematics. On June 22, 1941, the strategic focus of the Third Reich shifts permanently. Operation Barbarossa launches, directing the vast majority of men, machines, and industrial output toward the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front absorbs the lifeblood of the German military machine, leaving the Mediterranean as a secondary, low-priority theater. High Command expects miracles in the desert while focusing its industrial might entirely on the USSR. The Axis forces in Africa are left to operate on a fraction of the necessary resources. The assumption is that localized victories and captured enemy equipment will sustain the advance. The British, meanwhile, rely on global supply lines stretching around the Cape of Good Hope, bringing M3 Grant and M4 Sherman tanks directly to the front. The Axis alliance fails to secure the Mediterranean supply routes, leaving convoys highly vulnerable to attacks from Malta. The operational calculus in Berlin ignores the friction of distance. They demand continuous forward momentum without providing the fuel or transport capacity required to maintain it. The tactical brilliance of the Ghost Division and the Afrika Korps masks the growing deficit on the ledger. Command decisions are made based on lines drawn on maps, rather than the tonnage of supplies unloaded at the docks. High Command demands an empire in the sand, but refuses to pay the shipping costs. Out of 2.67 million tons of supplies shipped to North Africa, only 2.24 million tons reach the ports. The data reveals a slow, systematic starvation. Rommel receives an estimated 40% of his required operational supplies. While the Tiger tank boasts 4.7 inches of armor and can record a Sherman kill from nearly 3,000 yards, it becomes a static iron tomb without its required 4 gallons of fuel per mile. The geography of the theater imposes a strict mathematical penalty on every advance. Resupplying a single division in Africa requires 10 times the transport capacity of the Eastern Front. The ports of Tripoli and Benghazi lack the infrastructure to handle massive tonnage, and the coastal road stretches for hundreds of miles, exposed to the Desert Air Force. Every gallon of fuel burned by a Panzer III moving east requires another gallon of fuel to transport it from the port. High Command ignores these stark mathematical warnings. They prioritize operational momentum over logistical security. The Italian merchant marine suffers heavy losses attempting to cross the Mediterranean, sending thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel to the bottom of the sea. The supply lines are mathematically doomed, yet the orders from Europe demand continued offensives. The ledger is unbalanced. The tanks are operating on fumes, advancing further away from their primary supply hubs. The entire campaign rests on a foundation of borrowed time and captured British fuel dumps. The warnings are written in the manifest logs, ignored by commanders demanding territorial gains. The fuel gauges are dropping toward zero, and the final offensive is about to begin. Why does a highly mobile armored force willingly march into a geographical trap? 25 miles. That is the exact width of the bottleneck at El Alamein, where the sweeping maneuvers of the Desert War go to die. In June 1942, following the capture of Tobruk, the Axis forces face a critical strategic divergence. The original plan dictates halting the advance and utilizing the newly captured port to stabilize logistics, while the Luftwaffe neutralizes the island of Malta. Instead, intoxicated by the sudden collapse of the 8th Army, the decision is made to push the exhausted Panzerarmee Afrika eastward toward the Egyptian border and the Suez Canal. This is the irreversible gamble. The rapid advance stretches the logistical tether to its breaking point. The battlefield geographically narrows. The vast open desert of Cyrenaica, which previously allowed for sweeping flanking maneuvers by the 21st Panzer Division, funnels into a restrictive corridor. Bounded by the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the impassable Qattara Depression to the south, the terrain strips away the primary advantage of the Afrika Korps: maneuverability. The war of movement transitions into a war of static attrition. The British 8th Army digs in, anchoring their defenses on terrain that cannot be outflanked. The Axis forces arrive exhausted, their vehicles worn down by thousands of miles of desert travel and their fuel reserves virtually non-existent. The decision to bypass Malta ensures that Allied bombers and submarines continue to decimate Axis shipping in the Mediterranean. The strategic calculus of continuous pursuit overrides the basic tenets of supply. The Afrika Korps drives straight into a 25-mile funnel, unaware that the trap is already set. The grinding halt of steel tracks in the deep sand signals the end of an era. August 30, 1942. The Axis attack opens at Alam Haifa. The pivot arrives without warning. The offensive permanently stalls, not by enemy armor, but by the fuel gauge. Rommel falls directly into Montgomery's defensive trap. The panzers push forward, expecting to break the line, but the engines sputter and die. The realization is cold and final. As Rommel himself notes, guns and ammunition are virtually worthless if they cannot be moved around in vehicles with enough petrol. The mathematical reality ignored in Berlin finally manifests on the battlefield. The Afrika Korps is paralyzed. The tactical genius that defined the campaign is rendered irrelevant by a lack of basic resources. The tanks sit motionless, exposed to the relentless bombardment of the Desert Air Force. The advance that began in Tripolitania terminates in the sand of Alam Halfa. There is no maneuver left to execute. The 15th Panzer Division and the 21st Panzer Division are anchored to the desert floor, their operational capability erased by the logistical starvation that High Command deemed a secondary concern. The momentum is permanently broken. The Axis forces transition from a conquering army into a stationary target. The initiative shifts entirely to the Allies. The tactical brilliance of the past 18 months dissolves into the stark reality of empty fuel drums. The myth of the Desert Fox is paralyzed in the sand. The German war machine is immobilized, waiting for an industrially superior enemy to strike the fatal blow. It has got to be done. If necessary, I am prepared to accept 100% casualties in both personnel and tanks. Bernard Law Montgomery sets the operational calculus for the Second Battle of El Alamein, October 23, 1942. Tactics are replaced by mathematical slaughter. The Allied response is cold, calculated, and overwhelmingly industrial. Montgomery orders Operation Supercharge to break through Kidney Ridge on November 2nd. The British utilize their massive material advantage to methodically dismantle the Axis positions. The Royal Air Force decisively wrestles air superiority from the Luftwaffe, turning the sky into a continuous threat. The ground assault is backed by a crushing weight of artillery. By 1943, British artillery achieves a fire rate of 30 shells for every 1 German shell fired. The Mark VI Crusader and Churchill tanks push forward in waves. Artilleryman R.I. Cunningham watches his battery commander take a fatal hit in the throat from a Panzer IV shell. Disobeying orders to cease fire, Cunningham wrecks the tank with his last 2 rounds at close range. The battle becomes a systematic grinding of Axis armor. The Italian Ariete Division is annihilated, fighting with poor armament against superior numbers. Rommel laments losing his oldest Italian comrades, from whom he demanded more than they were capable of performing. The Eighth Army leverages its logistical supremacy, absorbing losses that the Panzer Army Africa cannot replace. The Axis forces are outgunned, outmanned, and starved of supplies. Against a 30-to-1 artillery deficit and a sky dominated by enemy aircraft, what happens to an army ordered by Hitler to stand and die? While the Führer demands a fight to the death from his chancellery in Berlin, the reality on the ground forces a massive withdrawal. On November 4, 1942, the Axis forces abandon El Alamein, openly defying direct orders to stand their ground. The complete and rapid geographic collapse of the Axis position in North Africa begins. The jaws of the Allied trap snap shut from both sides. Just 4 days later, on November 8th, Operation Torch commences. Anglo-American troops land in Morocco and Algeria, opening a massive new front to the west. The Panzer Armee Africa is now squeezed between 2 advancing armies. The leadership structure fractures. Panzer General Georg Stumme dies of a heart attack during the chaos, forcing a rapid recall of Rommel to the front. The retreat is a grueling march back across the very deserts they had previously conquered. The British Eighth Army pursues relentlessly. The Axis forces abandon equipment, vehicles, and personnel in a desperate bid to reach Tunisia. The Mareth line offers a temporary illusion of defense, but the material deficit is insurmountable. On January 23, 1943, the crucial port city of Tripoli falls to Allied troops. The primary logistical hub of the entire campaign is lost. By March 9th, Rommel flies to Germany, leaving the doomed army behind. The German High Command prepares to replace him, acknowledging the theater is lost. The macro-level consequences of the pivot are quantified in lost territory and retreating armies. The continent is lost. The operational objectives erased. The remaining forces are pushed into the final corner of Tunisia, waiting for the inevitable mathematics of surrender. On May 12, 1943, the remaining German troops in North Africa capitulate. Stripped of all tactical glory, the campaign ends in starvation and mass surrender. The Hermann Göring Division, starved for days, realizes the promised American bombardment is not coming. Hans Klein and his men break their small arms, singing as they throw the stocks and bolts of their weapons in all directions. There is no ammunition left to continue the fight. Silent suffering defines the final days. German soldiers endure brutal desert conditions, waiting until they physically keel over before seeking medical help. While High Command in Berlin continues to draw offensive lines on maps in Europe, the reality on the ground in Africa is reduced to soldiers breaking their own weapons over trees. The cold data of the surrender speaks for the fatal strategic calculus. The African campaign was doomed not by enemy maneuvers, but by the mathematics of logistics, ignored by a command that treated a continent as a mere sideshow.